forced to clean the mating hall in shame, until the cold alpha king caught the rejected omega scent. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Emily Carter stood alone in the vast mating hall long after the celebration had ended. The echo of laughter still clinging to the stone walls like a memory she couldn't scrub away, her hands wrapped around a wooden mop worn smooth by years of obedience. The floor beneath her boots cold enough to seep through the soles and settle in her bones. Every step she took measured and quiet because she had learned that drawing attention only invited cruelty, and tonight had already taken more from her than she could afford to lose. The banners overhead swayed slightly in the draft, silver and midnight blue, symbols of bonds formed and futures chosen, none of which belonged to her. Not anymore. Not since the word rejected had been spoken with ceremonial calm and sealed her place at the edges of pack life, where omegas like Emily were expected to disappear politely, to be useful without being seen. She moved inch by inch, wiping away spilled drinks, gathering wilted flowers trampled by dancing feet, her shoulders hunched as if to make herself smaller than her 5'4" frame, her pale hair pulled back tight so it wouldn't fall into her eyes and betray the sting there, because crying only made it worse. Crying made them smile. Somewhere behind her, she heard a pair of she-wolves pass by, their voices low and amused, and though they didn't stop, Emily felt the weight of their glances like a hand pressing her down, reminding her that this task was not about cleanliness but about lesson, about showing her where she belonged after failing to be chosen. She kept her head down and worked, breathing slow and steady, counting strokes the way she once counted steps on long walks at dusk, when the world felt softer and no one expected anything from her. The scent of the hall was thick with alpha dominance and fading celebration, and beneath it all, the fragile trace of her own omega scent flickered unsteadily, a quiet thing she struggled to keep contained, because being noticed for it had never ended well, not once. Her arms ached, the clock on the far wall ticking toward midnight, each second stretching like a mile. But she did not stop, because stopping meant being asked why she was still there, and answering meant speaking aloud the truth she tried to bury, that she had nowhere else to go. As she knelt to scrub a dark mark near the center of the hall, her fingers trembled despite her resolve, and the air seemed to shift, not with sound, but with a subtle pressure that made her pause, her breath catching as if the room itself had drawn in a long, careful inhale, and though she didn't look up, some instinct deep within her whispered that the night was not finished with her yet. Emily did not hear footsteps, yet she felt the change immediately, the way the air tightened, the way her chest grew warm and uneasy as if a storm had rolled in without warning, and she froze with the cloth pressed to the stone floor, her pulse quickening because every instinct she had learned to silence was suddenly awake. The scent came first, sharp and clean, like winter air over iron and pine, unmistakably alpha, not loud or aggressive but heavy with authority, and she knew without looking who it belonged to. Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood had returned to the mating hall, and that alone was enough to make the room feel smaller. Emily swallowed and forced her hands to move again, scrubbing harder than before, hoping to disappear into the work, because the cold Alpha King was not known for patience, and he was certainly not known for noticing omegas like her. She had seen him only a handful of times in her life, always from a distance, always surrounded by silence, his presence commanding without effort, his pale eyes unreadable, his expression carved into something calm and distant, like a mountain that did not care who stood at its base. Tonight, he stopped just inside the entrance, though Emily did not see it, only felt the subtle pause, the way his dominance settled across the hall in a slow, deliberate wave, causing her shoulders to tense despite her attempt to remain steady. Her scent betrayed her then, slipping free in a fragile, uncontrolled thread born of exhaustion and quiet fear, not sweet or inviting but raw and honest, carrying the truth she spent every day hiding, that she was tired. That reminder hurt, That rejection did not fade just because others told you to move on. Nathaniel inhaled without meaning to, his attention catching on something that did not belong, something out of place among stone and fading celebration, and his steps slowed, his instincts alert in a way they had not been all evening. He had expected emptiness when he returned, a silent hall waiting to be locked and forgotten until the next ceremony. But instead there was her scent, soft and restrained, pressed thin like a note held too long, and it drew his focus before his mind could intervene. Emily felt the weight of that attention like a hand resting between her shoulder blades, not touching, just present, and her breath hitched as she lowered her head further, heart pounding because she did not know what she had done wrong this time. Memories surfaced uninvited, the rejection ceremony, the way voices had turned polite and distant, the way she had been thanked for her participation and dismissed with a nod, as if her future could be folded away neatly and stored out of sight. She braced herself for an order, for a sharp word, for the quiet dismissal that followed most interactions with rank, but none came. Instead, there was silence, deep and stretching, and in that silence, Nathaniel studied the lone figure kneeling at the center of the hall, small against the wide floor, her movements careful, her presence subdued in a way that did not match the resilience woven into her scent. He took a step closer, not out of intent but curiosity, his boots soundless against stone, and Emily sensed the distance closing, her body reacting before her thoughts could catch up, her fingers curling tight around the cloth as if it could anchor her. The cold Alpha King had not meant to intrude, yet something about the contrast struck him, the grand hall and the solitary Omega, the echoes of celebration and the quiet labor left behind, and he found himself stopping again, gaze fixed on the bowed head of a young woman who had not once looked up, who carried herself like someone accustomed to being overlooked. Emily finally glanced up, just enough to confirm what she already knew, and her breath caught as her eyes met his, silver meeting blue for a heartbeat too long to be accidental, the moment stretching thin and electric, neither of them speaking, the hall holding its breath as destiny shifted, subtle and irreversible. Emily's breath remained shallow as the silence stretched, her heartbeat loud enough that she was sure he could hear it, and she lowered her gaze again out of reflex, because staring at an Alpha King was not permitted, not for someone like her, not for a rejected Omega still kneeling on the cold stone floor with a cleaning cloth in her hands. Nathaniel did not speak immediately, and that absence of command unsettled her more than any sharp order could have, because she had learned how to respond to instructions, how to comply and retreat, but she had never learned what to do when attention lingered without direction. He took another step closer, slow and unhurried, the faint sound of his boots grounding the moment in reality, and Emily felt the warmth of his presence like a change in weather, subtle but undeniable, stirring the delicate balance she fought so hard to maintain. She focused on breathing, on keeping her scent contained, but fatigue and nerves betrayed her again, the quiet note of her Omega essence trembling free despite her effort, and Nathaniel's brow furrowed almost imperceptibly as he recognized it not as provocation, but as restraint stretched to its limit. This was not the scent of an Omega seeking attention or favor, not something trained or practiced, but the muted honesty of someone who had learned to make herself small to survive, and that realization slowed him further. He glanced around the hall, at the overturned chairs pushed aside, the scattered petals, the empty cups waiting to be cleared away, and then back to Emily, still kneeling where others had danced only hours earlier, and something about that contrast did not sit right. Emily sensed the shift, the way the pressure in the room softened just a fraction, and though she did not dare look up again, her shoulders eased by instinct, her body responding to a change she did not fully understand. Nathaniel stopped. A few feet away, close enough that she could feel the heat of him now, close enough that his presence drowned out everything else, and still he said nothing, as if he were listening not to the room, but to the space between them. In that quiet, Emily's thoughts betrayed her, memories rising unbidden, of being told she was not suitable, that her bond was incomplete, that her future would be simpler if she accepted her limitations, and the sting of those words tightened her chest, her scent wavering again in response. Nathaniel inhaled once more, carefully this time, and his gaze sharpened, not with anger but with recognition, because there was no mistaking the trace of old hurt woven through her presence, the kind that lingered long after ceremonies ended and halls were emptied. He had ruled long enough to recognize when order was being upheld and when it was being misused, and as he looked at Emily, he understood that her place here was not coincidence but consequence, a silent extension of a judgment already passed. Emily finally gathered the courage to speak, though her voice barely carried, a soft apology forming out of habit rather than necessity. But before she could finish, Nathaniel raised a hand, not in command but in quiet interruption, and the gesture alone stilled her completely. He did not touch her, did not loom or lean, simply stood there, composed and attentive, and asked a single question in a calm, even tone that carried across the empty hall without effort, asking who had assigned her this task. The words landed like a shock, not because of their authority, but because of their focus, because no one had ever asked her that before. Emily hesitated, confusion flickering across her features as she looked up at him again, her pale eyes wide, trying to understand why the Alpha King would care, and in that moment, Nathaniel saw something shift, the faintest spark of strength beneath her caution, a reminder that submission did not erase worth, it only hid it. The hall remained silent, the night holding steady around them, as Emily prepared to answer, unaware that the question itself marked a turning point she could not yet see. Emily hesitated with the cloth still in her hands, her fingers tightening as if the simple question carried more weight than it should, because answering meant naming a truth she had learned to swallow quietly, and she was not sure if honesty was allowed in the presence of an Alpha King. She glanced toward the far end of the hall where the doors stood closed, as if the walls themselves might be listening, then drew in a steadying breath and spoke softly, explaining that after the ceremony ended, a senior pack attendant informed her that she would remain to clean, that it was considered appropriate given her status, and that refusal was never presented as an option. Her voice did not shake as much as she expected, though her scent trembled faintly, betraying the old sting that still lived beneath her calm. Nathaniel listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes cooled further, not toward her, but toward the unseen structure that had made such decisions seem ordinary. He asked one more question, measured and precise, inquiring whether this assignment was written, witnessed, or simply assumed, and Emily answered truthfully that it was assumed, the way many things were when it came to her, because she had learned that assumptions followed her like a shadow. Silence followed again, but this time it felt different, less heavy, as if the room itself were waiting for him to decide what kind of silence it would become. Nathaniel straightened slightly, his posture shifting from observation to resolve, and Emily felt the change ripple outward, subtle but unmistakable, the presence of a ruler settling into place. He told her to stand, not sharply, not as a command meant to test obedience, but as a simple instruction, and she obeyed on instinct, rising to her feet with care, her knees stiff from kneeling so long, her eyes lowered once more as she waited. When she was upright, he studied her fully for the first time, taking in her quiet composure, the way she held herself as if trying to occupy as little space as possible, and the faint resilience threaded through her scent despite everything. He spoke again, stating that the hall would be closed for the night, and that the cleaning could wait until morning, his tone even and unarguable, and Emily blinked in surprise, her breath catching because no one had ever dismissed her from a task without penalty before. She started to protest out of habit, to explain that she could finish quickly, that she did not mind, but Nathaniel shook his head once, the motion small but decisive, and told her that it was not a request. The words settled into her slowly, realization dawning as she understood that she was being released, not punished, and the confusion that followed was almost overwhelming. Nathaniel gestured toward the exit, indicating that she should leave and get some rest, and as she gathered her things with unsteady hands, she felt the lingering weight of his attention, not possessive, not intrusive, but thoughtful, as if he were committing something to memory. Before she could step away, he added one final statement, quiet but clear, telling her that she would not be assigned duties in the mating hall again without direct authorization, and though he did not say whose, the implication was unmistakable. Emily paused, then looked up at him fully this time, gratitude and disbelief mixing in her eyes as she whispered a thank you that felt insufficient, yet heartfelt. Nathaniel inclined his head in acknowledgment, already turning away as if the matter were settled. But as Emily walked toward the doors, the hall echoing softly around her, she sensed that nothing about this night had been simple, and that the cold Alpha King's attention, once caught, was not easily released. She stepped out into the cool night air, her heart still racing, unaware that from this moment on, she was no longer invisible, even to herself. Emily did not realize how tightly she had been holding herself together until she reached the quiet path beyond the hall. The night air cool against her skin as she slowed her steps and finally allowed her shoulders to drop, her breath coming easier with each pace away from the stone walls that had witnessed her humiliation. The moon hung low and pale, casting silver light across the grounds, and for the first time since the ceremony ended, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not relief exactly, but the fragile sense that she had been seen and not dismissed. She paused near the old oak at the edge of the courtyard, resting a hand against its rough bark as she steadied herself, her omega scent easing into something calmer now that fear no longer pressed against it, though it still carried the quiet echo of uncertainty. Inside the hall, Nathaniel remained where he was, long after Emily had gone. The empty space she left behind lingering in his awareness in a way he did not expect and did not immediately welcome. He moved slowly, his steps measured as he crossed the floor she had been scrubbing, his gaze tracing the path of her work, noticing the care in it, the effort to erase every mark as if she believed she herself needed to vanish along with them. The realization stirred something uncomfortable in him, a tension he had not felt since his early days of rule, when authority came with lessons learned too late and mistakes that left marks no one else could see. He closed his eyes briefly and inhaled again, not searching this time, but confirming what his instincts had already recognized, the unique thread of Emily's scent still present despite her absence, subdued yet resilient, carrying a depth that spoke of endurance rather than weakness. It unsettled him because it contradicted the labels his world relied on, and he had never been a ruler who ignored contradictions. Nathaniel straightened and turned toward the exit, his decision forming quietly, not dramatic or impulsive, but deliberate, the kind of choice that reshaped systems rather than moments. As he left the hall and stepped into the night, the cool air grounding him, he caught sight of Emily again in the distance, standing beneath the oak, her pale hair catching the moonlight as she leaned into the tree, like someone drawing strength from something older and steadier than pack law. He did not approach her, not yet, sensing that intrusion would shatter what little balance she had regained, but he watched long enough to confirm that she was not fragile in the way others assumed, only cautious, her strength folded inward rather than displayed. Emily felt the pull of awareness before she saw him, that subtle shift she was beginning to recognize, and though she did not turn, she knew he was there, the cold Alpha King standing at a respectful distance, his presence no longer heavy but attentive, like a watchful guardian who did not demand acknowledgment. She breathed through the moment, allowing herself to exist without apology, and when she finally resumed walking toward her small quarters at the edge of the grounds, she sensed his gaze follow her until she disappeared from view. Nathaniel remained still long after, committing the path she took to memory, the quiet determination in her steps, leaving an impression deeper than any grand display ever could. He understood then that this was not a passing curiosity, not an instinct to be dismissed or denied, but the beginning of an awareness that would require action, and as the night deepened around him, the Alpha King accepted that the order he upheld would not remain unchanged, not now that he had caught the scent of a truth long overlooked. Morning came quietly to the pack grounds, the kind of soft gray dawn that eased itself over stone and forest without ceremony, and Emily woke before the bell as she always did, her body conditioned to rise early even when no one demanded it. She lay still for a moment on the narrow bed in her small room, listening to the distant sounds of the waking pack, footsteps on gravel, doors opening, the low murmur of voices, and she wondered if the night before had been real or something her tired mind had created to soften the memory of rejection. Yet when she sat up and drew in a breath, she sensed it again, faint but unmistakable, a subtle awareness that had not been there before, like a thread newly woven into the fabric of her days. She dressed simply and stepped outside, the morning air cool and clean, carrying the scents of earth and pine. And as she made her way toward the communal path, she noticed the change almost immediately, the way conversations quieted as she passed, not with mockery, but with hesitation. A few wolves glanced at her with open curiosity, others with confusion, as if they were seeing her for the first time and did not know what to make of it. Emily kept her head down out of habit, though her steps felt steadier than usual, her scent calm, no longer trembling with constant apology. Across the grounds, Nathaniel observed the morning routine from the balcony of the main residence. His posture relaxed, but his attention sharp, tracking the subtle shifts he had set in motion before the sun rose. He had spoken with his council quietly at first light, issuing simple clarifications rather than accusations, reminding them that assignments made in the aftermath of ceremonies required oversight, and that assumptions based on status were not law. The message spread quickly, not through proclamation but through correction, a recalibration of expectations that unsettled those who had benefited from silence. As Emily crossed the courtyard, Nathaniel felt the now familiar pull of awareness, not overwhelming, not consuming, but persistent, and he allowed himself to acknowledge it without judgment, recognizing that instinct did not always arrive with answers, only direction. Emily sensed him then, the same way she had the night before, and though she did not look up, the knowledge of his presence steadied her rather than frightened her, grounding her in a way she could not explain. When she reached the steps leading toward the work quarters, a senior attendant called her name, not sharply, but with uncertainty, informing her that her duties had been reassigned for the day and that she was to assist in the archives instead, a neutral task, neither punishment nor reward. Emily nodded, surprise flickering through her, and thanked the attendant quietly before turning toward the main building, her path altering in a way that felt symbolic even if she did not yet have the words for it. Inside, Nathaniel watched her disappear through the doors, his decision from the night before settling into something firmer, because change, he knew, did not come from grand gestures alone, but from consistent attention, from choosing to see what others overlooked and refusing to look away once it was seen. Emily paused at the threshold of the archives, taking a breath as she stepped into the cool, quiet space, shelves rising around her filled with records of bonds and laws, and lives woven together over generations. And for the first time since her rejection, she felt a cautious spark of possibility, not hope exactly, but room to breathe. Outside, the pack continued its mourning, unaware that the balance it relied on had already begun to shift, guided not by spectacle, but by the quiet recognition of a scent that had refused to be erased. The archives carried a stillness that felt different from the rest of the pack, a quiet built from ink and parchment rather than hierarchy, and Emily found herself moving more slowly there, her fingers tracing the spines of old records as she worked, the faint scent of dust and age grounding her in the present. Hours passed without interruption, and with each careful task she completed, she noticed how her thoughts no longer circled the same familiar fears, how the knot in her chest loosened as the morning light filtered through high windows and settled across the long tables. When she stepped out at midday, she sensed it again before she saw it, the subtle awareness that had begun to feel like a constant companion, and across the courtyard, she caught sight of Nathaniel speaking with two council members, his posture calm, his voice low, the exchange measured rather than confrontational. The moment one of them noticed her, the conversation faltered, eyes shifting between the Alpha King and the Omega who had once been ignored, and Emily felt the weight of that attention ripple outward, curiosity spreading through the onlookers like a quiet tide. She kept walking, her steps steady, refusing to retreat into herself, and though she did not approach, the simple fact of her presence altered the dynamic, a reminder that what had been unseen could no longer be dismissed. Nathaniel dismissed the council members with a nod and watched Emily pass, his gaze thoughtful, recognizing how quickly perception could change when guided by authority, and how fragile such change remained without understanding. Word traveled faster than Emily expected, whispers threading through the pack, questions forming in hushed tones about why she had been reassigned, why the Alpha King had intervened, and what it meant that her scent lingered in his awareness when so many others did not. Some looked at her with suspicion, others with reassessment, and a few with something closer to regret, as if realizing too late that they had accepted an easy narrative without ever examining its truth. Emily felt the scrutiny but did not let it slow her, reminding herself with each breath that she had done nothing wrong, that being noticed did not require apology. By late afternoon, a formal notice was posted near the central hall, brief and precise, outlining new guidelines for post-ceremony duties and emphasizing respect regardless of status, and the pack gathered to read it, the impact immediate even without explanation. Nathaniel stood at the edge of the crowd, silent as reactions unfolded, observing the way orders shifted not through force, but clarity, and he understood that some would resist quietly while others adapted just as quietly, and both outcomes were part of change. Emily read the notice from a distance, her heart racing not with fear, but with cautious resolve, because seeing fairness written into law made it harder to deny, harder to twist into punishment disguised as tradition. As the crowd dispersed, she felt his presence draw nearer, not looming, not demanding, and when she turned, she found him standing a respectful distance away, his expression composed, his attention focused without pressure. He did not speak to her publicly, did not make a display of acknowledgment, but inclined his head in a subtle gesture that carried weight, without spectacle, and Emily returned it instinctively, a small nod that felt like a bridge rather than a bow. Those watching noticed anyway, the exchange sparking fresh murmurs, and Emily understood then that the pack was beginning to recalibrate around a new point of reference, one that included her whether she was ready or not. As the sun dipped lower and shadows lengthened across the grounds, Emily felt the strange mix of vulnerability and strength settle into her bones, the realization that being seen brought both risk and opportunity, and that retreating now would only reinforce the old assumptions. Nathaniel watched her walk away once more, her posture straighter than before, and accepted that whatever had begun with a single scent had now grown into something larger, a shift that could not be undone, and that the pack, for better or worse, was already responding. By the time evening settled over the pack grounds, the tension had shifted from sharp curiosity to something quieter and more dangerous, a watchful awareness that followed Emily no matter where she moved, and she felt it as she carried a small stack of ledgers back to the archives, her pace unhurried despite the weight of so many eyes. She told herself to focus on the simple rhythm of the work, the feel of paper beneath her fingers, the steady cadence of her breath, yet her senses remained attuned to the subtle pull that had become impossible to ignore. Across the grounds, Nathaniel moved with the same controlled calm he always carried, but inside his awareness traced the path Emily took as naturally as breathing, her presence registering with a clarity that unsettled him not because it was overwhelming, but because it was constant. He had spent years mastering the ability to separate instinct from action, to rule without allowing personal impulses to sway judgment. And yet this awareness did not feel like impulse. It felt like recognition, a quiet alignment that asked not to be indulged, but understood. As the sun dipped lower, he dismissed the last of his duties and walked the outer path that bordered the training fields, giving himself space to think, to test whether distance dulled the thread between them, but it did not. It remained, steady and unintrusive, like a compass needle refusing to be turned aside. Emily felt him then, closer than before, and this time she stopped beneath the lantern near the archive entrance, gathering the courage she had been building all day, because pretending not to notice no longer felt honest. When Nathaniel approached, he did so openly, his steps measured, his presence unmistakable, and though several wolves nearby paused to watch, he did not alter his course or lower his voice, signaling without words that what followed required no secrecy. He greeted her by name, simply and clearly, and the sound of it carried a weight that made Emily straighten despite herself, the acknowledgment settling into her chest like a promise rather than a claim. She returned the greeting, her voice steady, and waited, uncertain but no longer afraid. Nathaniel spoke of the archives, of the importance of preserving records accurately, of the way small oversights became long-standing injustices when left unexamined. And as he spoke, Emily understood that this was not a lesson directed at her, but an invitation, a recognition of her attention to detail, her patience, her capacity to see what others overlooked. He asked her opinion on a minor discrepancy he had noticed earlier, a simple question that nevertheless carried profound implication, because it assumed her insight mattered. Emily answered honestly, surprised by how natural it felt to speak without shrinking, and Nathaniel listened, not politely, but intently, as if the exchange itself was the point. Around them, the pack absorbed the moment, the Alpha King engaging a rejected Omega without condescension, without spectacle, and the murmurs that followed were quieter, thoughtful rather than sharp. As dusk deepened into night, Nathaniel concluded the conversation with a nod, telling her to continue her work and to bring any concerns directly to the council if needed, his tone making it clear that this was not permission granted out of charity, but expectation grounded in trust. Emily watched him go, her heart racing not with panic, but with the awareness that something fundamental had shifted, not only in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. She returned to the archives and finished her tasks with renewed focus, the lantern light warm against the shelves, and when she finally stepped back into the cool night air, she understood that the path ahead would not be simple, but it would be hers to walk, and somewhere beyond the visible, the cold Alpha King recognized that the scent he had noticed in shame had revealed a strength he could no longer ignore. The next morning unfolded with a clarity that felt deliberate, as if the pack itself had awakened aware that something irreversible had already taken root, and Emily sensed it the moment she stepped onto the main path, the air charged not with hostility, but anticipation. Wolves gathered near the central hall under the pretense of routine, conversations quieter, eyes sharper, attention drifting toward the space where authority often made itself known, and Emily felt the pull of it even as she tried to focus on the simple task she had been assigned, her hands steady despite the flutter in her chest. Nathaniel arrived without announcement, his presence rippling outward in the way it always did, not demanding silence, but commanding it nonetheless, and when he stopped at the base of the hall steps, the pack instinctively formed a loose semicircle, expectation settling like a held breath. Emily realized with a start that she stood near the front, not pushed there, not singled out by command, simply present, and the awareness grounded her rather than sending her retreating. Nathaniel's gaze swept the gathered wolves once before settling on her, and though the moment lasted only a heartbeat, it carried the weight of deliberate choice. He spoke then, addressing the pack in a calm, even tone, acknowledging the recent ceremony, the transitions it had brought, and the responsibility that came with change, his words measured, impossible to twist without exposing one's own bias. He spoke of oversight, of the dangers of tradition left unchecked, of how easily silence could become permission, and as he spoke, Emily felt the truth of it resonate through her, not as vindication, but recognition. Then Nathaniel did something no one expected. He called her forward by name, clearly and without hesitation, and the sound of it echoed across the stone, drawing every eye. Emily stepped out of the semicircle, her pulse steadying with each pace, her posture straight, and when she stopped before him, she did not bow or lower her gaze. She simply stood, meeting his eyes with quiet resolve. Nathaniel addressed her directly, asking her to confirm the work she had been assigned and the conditions under which it was given, not as interrogation, but record, and Emily answered honestly, her voice carrying across the open space, the truth simple and unembellished. When she finished, Nathaniel turned back to the pack and stated plainly that such practices would no longer be tolerated, that no Omega, rejected or otherwise, would be reduced to symbol or lesson, and that any future assignments would be issued with accountability and purpose. The words settled heavily, not as threat, but as law, and Emily felt the shift move through the crowd, surprise giving way to understanding, understanding to acceptance. Nathaniel then did something quieter, yet more profound, acknowledging Emily's composure, her diligence, and her insight, stating that these qualities reflected strength, not deficiency, and that strength deserved respect regardless of rank. He did not claim her, did not bind or brand or promise what neither of them was ready to name, but he made something else clear, that she was seen, that her presence mattered, and that from this moment forward, she would walk the pack grounds without shame. Emily felt the weight lift from her chest then, not because the past was erased, but because it no longer defined her future, and as she returned to her place among the pack, the path opening naturally before her, she understood that destiny did not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it came quietly, carried on a scent that refused to be ignored, and a single question that changed everything.